Today I'm going to show you how to make a fabulous caramelized onion and red wine soup with cheese crostoni. Crostoni are like big crostini. And this is a wonderful dish to make in the winter. You need very few ingredients. We're going to be using some unsalted butter. We have red onions. We have some Fontina cheese. We have our sourdough or country bread. We have some chicken stock, good, deep, dry red wine, and then some salt and pepper. Now you can make the cheese crostoni for this soup one of two ways. You can keep the bread completely dry and then just put the cheese on it, or you can do what I've been doing here, which is to brush a little bit of the red wine right onto the bread before you top it with the cheese. And this just reinforces that flavor of red wine even on the crostoni. So you have the option of doing it one of two ways. So the first step in making the soup is to get your onions caramelized. And for that, you want to use, ideally, red onions because they give it a really nice color and flavor. You can certainly use, if you want, just yellow onions. Now, you want to peel the whole onion. You can do this several ways. You can keep the onion round and then remove the top and the bottom. And then cut the onion in half. And if you want to get that sort of root end out because it's going to prevent the layers from falling apart, that's a good idea. And then we want to cut the onion along with the grain. And that's going to help it to kind of fall apart faster, which I like. Remember, when you caramelize onion, you're bringing out the sugars. And so you want to cook it nice, low and slow. Okay? So our onions have been sliced. Now it's time to get them cooking. We'll let them caramelize nice and slow in a heavy bottom pot. It's going to take about 30 minutes. So we're going to melt our butter. So you want to make sure you get a pot that's deep enough to cook the soup. You want it to be fairly wide at the base so that you have a lot of room for the onions to caramelize, but not so wide that essentially all your liquid is going to evaporate later. So something sort of with this aspect ratio, maybe just a tad taller than it is wide. And that's going to allow the onions to caramelize nicely, but when we add the stock later, it's not going to force that stock to reduce too quickly. Because after all, this is a soup, and you want to maintain a level of liquid in the pan at all times. So when our butter is melted, we're going to add the onions, and we're going to caramelize them gently over a medium-low heat. We're going to stir once in a while. That's important. We're actually pulling out the sugars from the onions with a gentle, lengthy cooking. So our butter is melted. We're going to put in our onions. And this is a tremendous amount of onions, but it will cook down. So a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, and that's going to help the onions to cook down. And we're going to turn that heat to a medium-low, because we really just want them to cook slowly. And we're going to put the lid on, which is super important. So once in a while, you need to stir your onions. Make sure they're not sticking or scorching. If they're coloring too much, then you're going to want to add a little bit of water just to prevent scorching. Let's take a look at our onions. They're beautiful. They've caramelized. They're sweet. We're going to turn up the heat now. And we're going to be adding the wine. And you want to use a wine that you'd be happy to drink, of course. That's very important. So let's put in our wine. And let's evaporate it out almost entirely before we add any stock. It's going to take about 5 minutes or so for this to cook down. You want to sweeten to lose all that sharpness before you go on to add any of the stock. Let's take a look at our wine. It's reduced very nicely. And it's not smelling strong anymore, so we're ready to add the stock. You can do this with vegetable stock, you can do it with beef stock, or you can do it with chicken stock. Pretty much whatever you prefer. There we go. We want to bring this to a boil, and then we want to let it simmer uncovered for about 30 minutes or so. You want those flavors to just become much more rich. Of course, if the soup reduces too much, you want to put the lid on it because you don't want this to evaporate too much. You just want to enrich the flavors with a small amount of evaporation. So here we have our sliced bread. We have one slice that we brushed with some of the red wine that we use in the recipe. And we have one slice that we're going to leave without any of the wine. So again, this is just an option. You can decide how you prefer it. Putting a little bit of red wine on the bread softens the bread, but it reinforces the flavor of the wine in the soup. So I'm putting the cheese right on top. I'm using Fontina. Now you can use whatever cheese you like. Fontina certainly tastes great. We're going to pop this in the oven for 5 minutes. Our soup is ready. I tasted it for seasoning. I adjusted with a little bit more salt. The pepper is just perfect. And now we're ready to serve. It's rich. The stock is reduced nicely. It's about 1/4 less or half less than it was roughly when it was first poured in. Smells just delicious. The first thing I like to do is to make sure that every bowl has a good amount of onions in it. You can always top it up with some of the broth after, but just make sure everybody has some onions. Our cheese crostoni smell like they're done. Let's go check. Oh yeah, perfect. Just lovely. Now, if you want the bread really crunchy, you can go a little longer. I don't like when the cheese turns dark, so I prefer to stop just shy of that. This is lovely. I'm going to use the one that has that red wine on it, just to reinforce the flavor of red wine in the soup. Pop that right on top. This soup is good piping hot. You don't want to get that bread too soggy. It's good if it imbibes some of the stock, but you don't want it to sit there for too long. So eat this right away. It is wonderful and comforting. I hope you enjoyed making this with me, and I'll see you again soon.